Right, good afternoon everybody. Welcome to UCL. My name is Jenny Wedgbury and I'm the Learning and Access Officer at the UCL Art Museum. It's lovely to see those who were here yesterday back again. Thank you for coming. For those who are here for the first day, it's nice to see you too. I hope you enjoy yourselves. We had some great debate, great discussions yesterday, so I'm really looking forward to continuing that on today. I have the rather boring task of just telling you about some of the practicalities of being in this space and some of the kind of facilities for the symposium. So we're in the Gustav Tuck Lecture Theatre at the moment. There is no fire alarm planned, but if one goes off, the fire exits are to this side and that side, and the meeting point is down the stairs and in the main quad. Okay? In terms of toilets and other facilities, they're all, unfortunately, on the lower ground floor, right the way back down the staircase that you came up or through by the lift. The men's and women's toilets are just down the stairs and then to the left as you come down. In terms of Wi-Fi, we do have a Symposium Wi-Fi access code, and the details are printed out on little posters on the side of the auditorium. So what you need to do if you want to access the UCL guest Wi-Fi is if you find it on your phone or your laptop, it will say UCL guest, and then it will take you to an opening screen, and you need to tick the self-service option, which is at the top. And then it'll take you through to registering your details, and you'll get a password that you can then use for the rest of the day. Any problems in the break, just come and see me and I'll hopefully be able to sort it out. In terms of promoting the symposium and what we're talking about and any interesting discussions that come up, we have a Twitter hashtag for the event, which is #emerging. And I checked yesterday, no one else in the world was using emerging as of yesterday. So unless there's a big conference on, I don't know, somewhere else in the world, I think we'll be okay. If you also could follow the UCL Art Museum and the Zabludowicz collection, will kind of be tag teaming each other and tweeting things as well. As I said, I'm Jenny Wedgbury and I work at the Art Museum. We've been organising this together with Kelly Large, who is the public programme curator from the Zabludowicz collection. And so I'm just going to hand over to Kelly now to do the introductions.
Hello everyone, welcome to the final, day 2, which is the final day of the Collecting the Emerging Symposium. As Jenny said, the symposium is some of you will have heard this yesterday. If you were here yesterday, then some of you will have heard this already, so I do apologise, but I can see lots of new faces, so I'm going to say it again. The symposium is a partnership between the Zabludowicz collection and the UCL Art Museum. And the reason that we've partnered together is because we both have collections that focus on emerging and experimental practice in various different ways. The collections come from very different contexts. The UCL Art Museum has been collecting emerging practice within an educational and academic context, and over the last 100 years has built a collection of work by Slade graduates. In comparison, the Zabludowicz collection is a young pup, I guess, in that the Zabludowicz collection was founded 20 years ago, so we are 20 years old. The Zabludowicz collection is a private collection with philanthropic aims, and the collection is open to the public. And it was founded by the Zabludowicz collection as a Zabludowicz family, as I said, 20 years ago. And we focus on emerging art from the late 20th century to the present day. Both organisations are at a stage where they are reflecting on their development and what it means to focus on emerging art practice. And hence it seemed like a good moment to maybe make some of that reflection public and develop a symposium that helps us think about these things. So the symposium coincides with the 20th anniversary of the Zabludowicz collection and also with the reopening of the UCL Art Museum after an extensive refurbishment. Both organisations have exhibitions celebrating their collections on at the moment. So there are various spots today where you can go and visit Relaunch, which is the exhibition at the UCL Art Museum. And there is also an opportunity to visit the Slade BA shows a bit later today. Last night, at the end of the proceedings, we had a visit to the Zabludowicz collection to see our current show and also experience a new work by one of the artists in the exhibition. Unfortunately, we're not doing that again tonight, but please do come up and visit our show, which is Zabludowicz collection 20 years. And I'm sure in your conference packs there is information about that show, so have a look at it. Okay, so I guess to get on to the aims of today, over recent years, there has been an exponential growth in interest in emerging art and emerging artists. And I guess the aim of this symposium is to just kind of figure out, unpack, question why this has happened. And I guess yesterday we looked at what the term emerging might mean. It's an all-pervasive term, it's everywhere. In fact, I was talking to somebody earlier today who was saying they went to the Slade BA show's opening last night and said all they could hear was the word emerging. Every single artist was being described as an emerging artist. But does this term, yesterday we talked about whether this term actually meant anything, I guess, and who owns it? Is it a word that artists own, or is it a word that the people around art, the professionals, own? We also explored the economic, critical and aesthetic value in the emerging art market, and also on a global platform as well. And today, we are going to, the first session is going to explore the relationship between emergence and historical narratives, archives and taxonomies. And we're also going to look at what emergence and what, I guess, being nascent relates, and how that relates to artist practices, education and career. The two sessions today will take place here in the Gustav Tuck Lecture Theatre. There's a break between 3 and 3:30 with refreshments down in the South Cloisters where you registered this morning. We'll be finishing up around 5 o'clock, and then we're going to have closing drinks downstairs in the South Cloisters. That's another opportunity to look at the Relaunch show and also maybe visit the Slade shows as well. We are live streaming the event, so when we open out to questions, please make sure that you wait for the mic so we can hear you. And so the first session today is entitled Emerging Taxonomies, Emerging Archives and Emerging Narratives. There will be 3 presentations followed by a moderated discussion and then questions from the audience. I'm going to stop talking now and hand over to Dr. Nina Perlman, who will introduce each of the speakers and moderate the session. Dr. Nina Perlman has been involved in developing the symposium and has really helped generate the content. And she leads the UCL Art Museum and has been doing so since 2008. She is a contemporary art writer and curator and also a public art specialist. So over to you, Nina.
Thank you, Kelly. Indeed, it is a great pleasure to introduce the speakers this afternoon. We have Dr. Ben Cranfield.
Oh, thank you. Okay, great. Yes, so I'll say that again, that it is a great pleasure to be here, and thank you for giving up your Saturday to join us. And we will have Dr. Ben Cranfield with us today, who is the director of the doctoral program in Humanities and Cultural Studies, and also the MRes in Cultural Inquiry at Birkbeck College. We will also be joined by Ellen Mara de Wakta, who is an independent curator and writer, and Dr. Timotheus Vermeulen, who is assistant professor in cultural theory at the Radboud University in Nijmegen in the Netherlands, and he is also co-founding editor of the Notes on Modernism journal. Later, everyone will join us on the podium, but we'll just do one by one at the moment. Over to you.
so, yeah. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks also, I guess, very much for inviting me on, to the Zabludowicz and UCL. I'm very grateful, though a bit intimidated, I guess, to be here in this wonderful room. I'm not entirely sure what's going to happen in the next 40 minutes. I have a sort of idea of what I want to talk about, and I have a sort of ending in mind. But I was speaking the last 2 days on a conference on the Anthropocene, and that really messed me up entirely. But I guess in a good way. I was very much out of my depth, which I tend to be on every occasion I go to, really. But here it felt as if I was constantly trying to latch on to these discussions. And it brought up all new ideas, and so I have a sort of a start of a talk, and I guess I also have an ending of a talk, and in the middle I'm going to speak about something that I speak often about, which is metamodernism, but I'm not entirely sure about how to frame it. So let's see how that goes. I also should say that I'm going to read some parts that are either too corny for me to look you in the eyes when I'm saying it, or that I am super uncomfortable with because I'm not entirely sure what's going on. So I'll read some parts, and then other parts I'll try and parlay to you like this. So, as the title of my talk suggests, I wish to talk about what it means to historicize the present. That is to say, to put one single ism on developments that, from the outset, appear to be very different and perhaps even incompatible. My argument is that, though it is not popular, though it is a project that, especially I guess with artists who want nothing more to be authentic, to be singular, often meets with yuck-like responses. It is a necessary means, I think though, to understand the relationship of contemporary art, of those authentic and individual practices, which I'm not denying that they are, to relate those practices to contemporary culture more broadly, and perhaps also the relationship of contemporary art to those practices that were, or that may be, or already are becoming. There are 3 parts to the talk. First, I reflect in broad strokes, and a bit erratically, on the nature of cultural categorization, the grouping of individual artworks under a generalist label. Second, I put forth the passage of postmodernism to post-postmodernism, or metamodernism, as I and many others have come to name it, a term which I think, for better or worse, is the one that we've chosen to understand the present. And third, I want to list, and that's sort of really a sort of closing statement, I want to list some of the problems involved in categorization. And the aim, I really want to make that clear, is not, I'm not providing some kind of definitive kind of word. I should never do that, but also I want this to be seen as the opening of a kind of debate, the opening of a discussion about this process, this project of historicizing the present. So, part 1, This is Water. In a talk, a very famous one, that he gave at Kenyon College in 2005, the overhyped novelist, who I love but I think is also still overhyped, novelist and essayist David Foster Wallace shares with the audience a story that I want to relate to you here as well. The story, and you may know it, is the following, and I quote, "There are these 2 young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, 'Morning, boys, how is the water?' And the 2 young fish, they swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over and says to the other, 'What the hell is water?'" The point that Foster Wallace wants to make is, and I quote, is that the most obvious, ubiquitous realities are often the hardest to see and talk about, end quote. But the story, perhaps unwittingly, but I think he knows it, envelopes a larger argument. The young fish and the old one, you and I and my partner and the friends and family of my partner and our neighbors and their neighbors and so on, all of us, however different our individual lives may be, however much we differ when it comes to the house we live in or the work that we do, however much money we may have, leisure time and so on, that all of us nonetheless share the reality of the water. A reality that, as Foster Wallace notes, sustains us, but that we're very rarely aware of. And what I want to contemplate here briefly, haphazardly, erratically, is our relationship to this water. My argument is not necessarily that we are fish living in water, though this too, I guess, is part of my inquiry. Not literally, I mean, I'm not saying we're living in water. I guess that much is probably obvious. Rather, what I want to think about today are the ways that we live across waters. For though we all live in water, we do not all live in the same water exactly. Some of us fish, those of you in the UK maybe, you live in sweet waters. If that's, I don't know if that's a term, but sweet waters, like, you know, the opposite of salty waters. Because others, like me, living in Germany, maybe that is a salty water, to give you an example. I am no oceanographer or marine biologist, like my good friend George Costanza from Seinfeld, far from it, but having watched Finding Nemo, I know that there is also a difference between the transatlantic cold water stream and the warm Gulf Stream, or something like that. Presumably, there's other differentiations as well. It's all water, but there are these inflections, these sort of dialects within the water. It means something differently, obviously, to live in sweet water than it does to live in salty water. Perhaps you, as a specimen, have developed strategies specific to the water's taste. Presumably, the environment is an environment that thrives in either one of the two water types. We speak, after all, of sweet water fish and of saltwater fish, or saltwater plants. In Finding Nemo, the moment Nemo's father moves from the water, and this is sort of my reference generally, I mean, the level of my thinking. And you laugh, but people who know me know this is true. In Finding Nemo, the moment Nemo's father moves from the warm stream to the cold one, or the other way around, he has to adapt to his new environment. He learns, for example, how to swim faster. And he learns how to swim in a school with other ocean creatures, like turtles. That is to say, he develops certain ontological properties and/or epistemological strategies, and perhaps even aesthetic qualities, specifically and exclusively on the basis of his surroundings. In other words, we are affected by and express the nature of the water we inhabit. Presumably everyone living in salt water has salt in his body, whatever their other differences. Or all the plants in the cold water stream might have roots able to withstand the cold, even if all of them look very dissimilar above the ground, or alternatively, look exactly the same above ground as plants in salty water, in warm water, but plants who share no such root structure. My argument is that living in the present, which is, as far as I'm aware, the only temporality at this moment that we can live in, is the equivalent to living in one of these waters, as one as opposed to the other. And there are two implications to this assumption. First, it is suggested that there is at any one moment in time a commonality between various practices, however different those practices are from one another, ontologically, epistemologically, and/or aesthetically. And second, it is inferred that this commonality can be intimated by comparing it to the ecosystem of other waters, that is to say, other moments in time. Meaning, after all, we know thanks to the post-structuralists, is understood through differentiation. We now only look for salt if we understand that salt is not necessarily present elsewhere. Indeed, if we translate Foster Wallace's story about ocean ecology to culture, which of course it is indeed already about, we could say that each moment in time produces its own distinct cultural logic, or dominant, as Jameson would say. The historians of the Annales called this mentality. Remember those guys? Mentality. Michel Foucault described it as discourse. Raymond Williams, the theorist whose critical vernacular I love and will later try and adopt a bit, called it a structure of feeling. Zeitgeist is the term most often used in popular discourse, and I've recently come to love Noel Carroll's notion of the mood as opposed to an emotion very much. The Indian Ocean could be read in this sense as, say, the logic of the Renaissance, and the North Sea as the dominant discourse of the Reformation. Perhaps the cold stream is modernity, and the warm stream is what is often called postmodernism. I mean, this is becoming a bit... What this means is that in different waters, the exact same painting, depicting the exact same scene, made with the exact same oil painting on the same canvas, will differ nonetheless. I can't stress this enough. And it's the same like with whiskey. So if you have, like whiskeys, if you have a whiskey that's built at the sea, made at the sea, or if it's made in the mountains, I'm not a whiskey expert, so this might backfire tremendously, but I've been told that whiskey made at the sea and whiskey made in the mountains is made with the exact same product. So what is it, barley or grain and ionized water. And yet, there's this remarkable thing that whiskey that is made at the seaside tastes salty. No one has put salt in, but it's somewhere lingering in the air. And the whiskies that are made in the mountains do not have this saltiness. And so, although no one puts it in, it's kind of there. Williams also says this when he speaks about structures of feelings. He says, so you have this thing, this object, this art object, and you analyze the hell out of it. And you take it entirely apart, and so you've got like these little pieces lying around. And then he says there's something left. And he can't explain it. And so for Williams, this is the structure of feeling. This was left over after thorough analysis. And of course, he later then develops it. But in the initial moment in film and the dramatic emotion, he describes it as such. As this saltiness. It's there. No one put it in, and yet it's there. So it's kind of in the air. Okay, so this painting will differ. In salty waters of the Renaissance, it will display aftertastes of salt, and in the sweet waters of the postmodern, it won't. It will be easier to swallow, maybe, since salty water isn't half as nice as lemonade. That was a classic joke I get. Thanks for the laughter. That was not uncomfortable at all. Interestingly, if it was to be swept up by the currents, moved from salty seas to sweeter pastures, it presumably displays both traces of salt and of sweetness, is a sort of umami or something, or sweet and sour sauce, as Sloterdijk says. No longer one taste, but also not yet entirely the other. So in speaking about cultural production, we cannot but also speak about the culture that produces. And I know this is obvious. I know this is kind of something we all know, and yet I find it so important to stress, because it also at the same time is very often absent from the discussions, at least that I read. Maybe I read very selectively, but I do feel the Finding Nemo makes very little mention of this kind of stuff. So artists, or in any case interesting artists, produce individual works that are certainly not reducible in any sense to the taste of the spirit of the times, but they cannot but betray some kinds of relationship to it, however insignificant. Even the fish that hates water, that denies the existence of water, lives in water after all. The salt water fish living in sweet water will not be at ease if he is to survive at all. The artistic anachronism is literally the fish out of the water. And if you want to talk about art, then we therefore must also always talk both about these individual qualities as well as about the sensibility, this leftover salt, that they may infer. The effect that the water has had on its product. What is the taste, I am asking, i.e. the structure of feeling, the mood of emerging art, art that is currently about to come in. And so, in the second bit, what I want to consider, what I want to briefly sort of talk about, is the passage from what we may call a postmodern moment, a postmodern sea, a sea with a distinct kind of postmodern flavor, to another kind of sea. So we've certainly, over the last 20 years, I guess, we've been moving, which is not to say that this sea, that I would call metamodernism, wasn't always already part of the sea, or there were sort of currents, intermingling, predecessors. They were definitely there, I would say, many times. But that there was one kind of flavor that was dominant within the postmodern, or however you want to call it, and within the current moment. And so I want to consider those flavors. And so this is the starting point. This is the starting point for what I would call metamodernism. This is a selection, and of course it's a reductive selection, I'll come back to that, of some of the things that have been happening over the past 20 years, I guess. 10 years. Maybe I should say 10 years. The past 10, 15 years. Maybe I should say 15 years. So the past 15 years, this has all been happening. And these are very different phenomena. So I'm thinking here, for example, of the immense success, the absolute hype around David Foster Wallace. Not necessarily his novels as much as his essays. Few people seem to read his novels, which The Pale King was unbearable, intentionally so, I guess, but also just unbearable. But his essays are very easily to read. And so his essays. And so Foster Wallace, in this hugely famous quote, writes, for example, in 92. So this is really quite old. He writes, "Sarcasm, parody, absurdism, and irony are great ways to strip off stuff's mask and to show the unpleasant reality behind it. The problem is that once the rules of art are debunked, and once the unpleasant reality, the irony diagnoses are revealed and indeed diagnosed, then what do we do?" So Foster Wallace is writing these essays, and he's looking around, and he's thinking, okay, so all these authors of my generation, Easton Ellis, of course, at that moment most clearly, but also Barth in America, they are diagnosing. There are doctors who are diagnosing. They're saying to the patient, you are really ill, man. There's something terribly wrong with you. And I'm going to explain to you all this stuff that is wrong. And so Foster Wallace says, this is really clever and very important. Well, what do you do when the patient is ill and won't get better, but says, hey, I'd like to kind of go back into society. And so Foster Wallace is about this moment. Do you leave the patient in his bed, or will you try and get him out into society nonetheless? Will you stop at the diagnosis, or will you try and work with it? In any way, so Foster Wallace is writing this in essays. We see at the same time, or a bit later, we see films like Royal Tenenbaums, aesthetically completely different kinds of texts. A text that my dear friend James McDowell, who is with us today, has called quirky cinema. We're also seeing here developments like Occupy, where lots of, I guess mostly middle-class youth take to the streets to protest a system which I think fairly they feel is not treating them right, which is not doing well. And so as a strategy, in order to undermine, in order to change the idea, change the way in which we think about capitalist production, which is all about circulation, it's about the constant flow of money, as Marx also says, but this constant flow, they fixate. They start sitting down in places in order to disrupt that flow, but also to understand that perhaps things could be different. Perhaps something could be different. Okay, so Occupy, I don't want to say too much about it yet. We see in the arts, and this I think is massively present, the return of manifestos, of programs, of a sort of constructive kind of engagement. I mean, every time I go to fairs or galleries or off spaces, I see these engaged projects, which is again not to say that it wasn't the same before, but, and I'll come back to that, something seems to have changed. Guido van der Werf I'll come back to, and we see, of course, in politics, we see stuff like this happening. Yeah, we see the disintegration of the political center. So we had New Labour, and I mean, you guys might be getting it back. That's terrible, I guess. I thought it couldn't get a bit more worse than Tories, but there's Tony Blair. In any case, so we see this disintegration of the political center everywhere. In Greece, in France, in Holland, where I'm from, in Germany even, where I currently live, we see this disintegration of the political center. If the 90s were about, and I'll come to that, peace and plenty, and the centralization, the third way politics, which was so immensely successful everywhere. I mean, in Holland, it was Wim Kok speaking about shaking off the ideological fetters, and in Germany, in France, all these guys were following Blair with his third ways of centralization, and this was happening here with the Tea Party, and with Occupy, and with parties like these. And of course, we've seen the financial crisis. And we see in architecture, yes is more, a kind of affirmative green architecture. These things are at once completely different from one another, related to completely different fields, completely different disciplines, using completely different strategies, or having completely different aesthetics. But also, they share something. They share something that this bunch did not so much share. And I'll explain. So this is all a bit vague, but I'm coming back to this. So this is the sea. This is the sea of the present as I posit it. And you can, of course, disagree with me, but this is a picture from the West, because I am from the West. I cannot speak about any other position than the position that I am in myself. I'd love to, but I just can't. So this is the picture that I would see from a Western male white position. This is another position. This is the bunch. This is my memory, I guess, of the 1990s, of the late 1980s, late 1990s. Of course, we know this, the Cheshire Cat with his best friend, Gaddafi. And of course, we can blame Blair for this, but everyone was doing this. Like, everyone was like, hey, Gaddafi, what a hell of a dude. And then, of course, he wasn't, and then, so the centralization of politics, these poles are drawn in together. This is the picture of the 90s. We've got in the arts what Foster Wallace just described as a diagnosis, the idea of diagnosing stuff that's wrong. The idea that Mark Fisher, in that fantastic little book of him, Capitalist Realism, calls the end of the alternative. The moment that we are aware that there is no alternative outside of what we have, that we've reached the end stage, I'm already getting ahead of myself, that we are here and we have to deal with what we've got. This is the situation at hand. There's no other situation. There's no more future. There's no more alternative, Thatcher says. And Blair says the exact same thing. There's no alternative. It's the mixture of left and right, or it's the moving from left to right, or however we want to describe New Labour. Yeah, but we see that end of the alternative. And so in the arts, we no longer get alternative scenarios, we no longer get utopian visions. We do get them, but not as the dominant taste of the sea. We get deconstruction. We get the critical reflection, which I think is very important and still is today, the critical reflection on all kinds of practices around us. Patriarchy, consumerism, neoliberalization of the universities, racism, I don't know, institutional racism, all these kinds of practices. Architecture, famously, a very different kind of thing, about eclecticism. Yeah, we all remember Jameson writing about Venturi, Lyotard writing about architecture's minor modifications, the idea of an eclectic architecture that is concerned more with form than with function. In cinema, we here have what Jeffrey Scones calls the smart film. Films that have a very disinterested kind of approach to their subject matter. And happiness, all these terrible things are happening, rape, pedophilia, and the camera stays silent on this sort of distance, and it doesn't seem to care at all. And so the director is not making any kind of moral judgment, but is leaving that moment up to us. Is asking us to decide whether we find things funny or sad. Generation X, that great successful novel by Douglas Coupland, in which he describes the end at MTV culture, Beavis and Butthead. The notion that there's a generation who've got nothing more to offer, got no further to go except for buying shampoos in different brands. Nirvana, who also see no outside, a very different genre, grunge, who also see no outside and have this sort of primal scream of desperation. The success of Wall Street, etc. So this is the 90s. I mean, I'm of course being manipulative here, but bear with me. This is the 2000s. This is the 90s. And what I'm doing, I know sometimes I may sound as if I'm saying that one is better than the other. That's definitely not what I want to do. There's no value judgment here, except for Tony Blair. And the Tea Party, I guess. The Tea Party I also think is really pretty awful. Or UKIP. I mean, we could basically make a very long argument. But in any case, so, except for all the politics, I don't want to make any judgment here. 90s, 2000s. And although these things are very different, although this is very different aesthetically and also strategically from this, and this is very differently, we assume, but we don't know all the stories, from this, and this is very different from this, there is something. When people speak about the 90s and people speak about postmodernism, the sort of period term given to this period, they speak, as Jameson says in this fantastic, absolutely fantastic book, they speak about an ending. The last few years, Jameson writes, have been marked by an inverted millenarianism in which premonitions of the future, catastrophic or redemptive, have been replaced by senses of the end of this or of that. The end of ideology, the end of art, of social class, the crisis of Leninism, social democracy, the welfare state, etc. And taken together, perhaps all of these endings constitute what is increasingly called postmodernism. And of course, I guess on the left side of the spectrum, we can think of Lyotard's End of the Grand, the meta-narrative, yeah, the legitimizing narrative that it says it's okay for you to do all those things, to kill in the name of, to sacrifice in the name of French Revolution, Robespierre, Saint-Just, the communism, Nazism, all these grand narratives, but also on the right side of the spectrum, Fukuyama's End of History, where Fukuyama says, it's not so much that we should no longer, like Lyotard says, believe in grand narratives. It's just that after such a long battle between different grand narratives, between all these legitimizing stories, there's only one left. And conveniently for Fukuyama, it's his. It's America, which is a great moment, I think, for all Americans. I don't know if there's any here, but in the 90s that was, I don't know, that was kind of the time. I remember also the Dream Team. This was the end of history. With the unabashed victory of liberal democracy, Fukuyama writes, in, by the way, a fantastic book. I disagree with it wholeheartedly, but the book I think is amazing. With the unabashed victory of liberal democracy, mankind had achieved a form of society that satisfied its deepest and most fundamental longings. This does not mean that the natural cycle of birth, of life, and of death would end, that important events would no longer happen, or that newspapers reporting them would cease to be published. It meant rather that there would be no further progress in the development of underlying principles and institutions, because all of the really big questions had been answered. And I think, looking back, this now seems kind of naive, given what all the stuff that has been happening. But I think at this moment, with people like Baudrillard writing also, and Virilio, I think this made quite a lot of sense to many people. But the idea that all of these very different practices, and they are very different in many respects, share this sense of an ending. The end of the alternative, and so the focus on a criticism on what is actually present. The end of purity of form. The end of affect of empathy, as Jameson speaks about Warhol, and it also counts here. The end of a future, the end of a future, the end of... so we have all these endings. That's quite nice. We have all these endings. And so for Jameson, for Lyotard, for Fukuyama, the sense of an ending is really what they speak about when they speak about postmodernism. It's not a style. It's not a stylistic register. Postmodernism is not, for these guys, a stylistic register. It is not a program. It is not, and it is, I'm not saying postmodernism per se isn't, because of course we know that there's like a million books about postmodernism, and some of them are programs, and some of them are styles, and some are, but for Jameson, it is not a style. It is something else, something that he calls a cultural dominant, the taste of the sea. Something is shared by all these very different practices, and so we tie them together and give them a label. And I would say that if we look at these practices, however different they are, however little they seem to have in common on all these levels, they also share a particular premise, which is the return of that idea of history. But not maybe the return of history as a project, but the return of history as a kind of projection. The possibility of history has returned. Not, I would say, the actuality in any of these things. Not the actuality of history, but the possibility of history. That is to say, the possibility of a developmental narrative for mankind and the earth. I think that should definitely now be part of it. And the earth as a kind of story that we want to latch onto and hopefully then improve ourselves or whatever. So the idea of history as a possibility, as a projection, has returned. And this was to sort of give you an idea of different names that are given to practices that are very similar to this. And that although we may not want to agree on what kind of ism we want to give this in the long run, each of these practices to an extent describes the return of something, the return of an attempt again to try, the return of an attempt to feel something, etc. This idea of the return of a new beginning, I think especially these guys. And I'm not entirely sure about speculative realism because I don't know enough about it. I love some of these books very much. Some of them I'm not so sure. I just don't know yet how to place myself. But what I think is interesting here is precisely also the idea of the return. Via that weird kind of critique of Kant's correlationism, which is, I don't know, maybe true, maybe very dubious. There is the idea again to this kind of ontological behind, which is wonderful. Suddenly we are able again to engage with stuff. And I think for artists, all of them jumping on it, this is so great because it's a kind of new legitimizing narrative. And new materialism is also quite similar, but this idea of grasping behind, you can touch something. So the idea of a return. If postmodernism, if the 90s is about the end of all kinds of shit, then this is about the return of all those stuff. But not a sort of hard return, but a different return. And I'll explain about these differences in a second. So the terms I've used in the past to present this is Raymond Williams' ridiculously magisterial, fantastic concept of the structure of feeling, which he develops sort of in fits across his career. There's once in Marxism and literature he develops a chapter to it, but in other pieces just a few pages, sometimes even just one little paragraph. And he develops it across, I think, 30 years. And it never becomes a coherent kind of thing, but the premise is this: the salt that remains after you've taken apart all the little pieces of the whiskey. It's that leftover little ingredient that really distinguishes the taste of that whiskey from the others. A structure of feeling, Williams says in one of his later works, is a particular quality of social experience, historically distinct from other particular qualities, which gives the sense of a generation or of a period. This is the water. This is the sweet water, and then the salt water. This is what he's speaking about. And so Jameson also uses to describe postmodernism Williams' concept. He calls it a cultural dominant, but he acknowledges early on that it's based on this principle. And I was recently thinking, when I was thinking about the Anthropocene, about the mood. The idea that, okay, this is a structure of feeling, a kind of, it's structural in the sense that all of us feel it, that all of us are aware that it's there, it's everywhere. And yet it's also very fleeting. We can't really pin it down. We can't really say, this is what it is. It's kind of a fleeting, ephemeral kind of thing, a feeling. Sort of a feeling quality. Oh, wow, 10 minutes, okay. So the structure of feeling. So I want to introduce this idea of the mood by Noel Carroll, the famous philosopher. Noel Carroll speaks not about a structure of feeling, but about a mood. And maybe I was thinking we could also understand this change of water, the change of a water in which very different fish live, but they share the sense of an ending, postmodernism, to another kind of water, which also has all kinds of super different creatures which have very little to do with each other, but they also share something, which is this idea of the return, the idea that once again we must think about something else, we must think about an alternative, because there is no other way, perhaps, that this water could also be perhaps a mood. I'm reading this out. In his brilliant 1976 essay, Art and Mood, philosopher Noel Carroll distinguishes between an emotion and a mood. An emotion, Carroll writes, is a response to a state of affair in the world. It is directed towards a particular object, and it is short-lived. So this is an emotion. We're not yet there with a mood. An emotion is directed towards a particular object, and it's short-lived. If I'm angry, after all, the anger is related to something or someone who has angered me. I might well depart with my anger if that person apologizes. For example, if I'm angry because my partner has put the organic waste in the regular bin instead of the recycling bin, this is a terrible, we all know from Serial Mom that this is the worst thing that can happen. I know you've seen it, it's a great film. I might shout or whisper, depending on how maybe it's a very repressive relationship, but maybe, so at least I'm saying to my partner, you are killing the planet. Which, might be exaggeration, but I do think it's kind of true. So, and if I say that, and if in response my partner then says, I'm really sorry, I am super sorry, which is my sort of wet dream of how interactions with my partner go, and never do, but imagine a scenario where my partner then says, I'm super sorry, and you're completely right, Tim, then chances are very likely, given how forgiving I am, that I forgive that person instantly. An emotion is related to an externality that transgresses your affective boundaries, as it were. If it retreats, your harmony is likely restored. A mood, by contrast, Carroll notes, and I'm quoting here this bit, is dependent on the overall state of the organism. A mood is dependent on the overall state of the organism, on its level of energy, the level of resources at its disposal for coping with environmental challenges, and the degree of tension it finds itself in as a result of the ratio of its resources to its challenges. I like that very much. I'm going to read it again. So for Carroll, a mood is dependent, and maybe you already know this and you're thinking, but in any case, so a mood is dependent on the overall state of the organism, on its level of energy, the level of resources at its disposal for coping with environmental challenges, and the degree of tension that it finds itself in as a result of the ratio of its resources to its challenges. End quote. What Carroll suggests here is that whereas emotion is the effect of an external transgression of your affective boundaries, mood is the result of an internal, or rather still, an internalized disintegration of the affective register. A lack of sleep maybe, or too much sleep, stress, relaxation, too little exercise, a lot of exercise, unhealthy food, smoothies, all of these together, they disorganize the body's affective automata. I think the mood is a sense of the disorganization internally of the affective automata, the intensities, if you will. Indeed, as Carroll continues, is the quote, a mood is non-intentional and often protracted. When I'm irritable, he writes, in an irritable mood, there is no one in particular who irritates me. Everyone and everything that falls into my pathway is likely to become the locus of my foul mood. And of course, in this case, end quote, in this case, the anger that I might feel towards my partner precedes the waste incident, nor is it, for that matter, related to my partner, though it may well be exacerbated by either of them. It subsequently will not reside when he or she apologizes. Emotion, Carroll perceptively suggests, emotion cuts through the tale, while mood pulls ambient detail into its orbit. And so, an emotion and a mood. And so an emotion, I don't want to speak about. I just like very much the bit that he wrote about it. But this idea of a mood, the idea that the structure of feeling may also perhaps be conceptualized as a mood in Carroll's sense. So not maybe the Spinoza sense, but sort of this sense that Carroll is introducing. This idea of a response of your body, of your affective automata, to an incapability of your body somehow to cope with the external world, which I like very much. So the idea that there is this disintegration, this messing about internally of what is happening. So if we speak about the mood, if we speak about a sweet mood or a salty mood or the sense of an ending mood or the sense of a return mood, then we're not speaking about an instant response also to a societal problem, but we are speaking about the capability of our body as a society to cope with the stuff that is happening around us. And so I think it's so useful, this concept of the mood, because it allows us to also begin to understand some of these cultural phenomena in terms or in relationship to some of these political, ecological, financial, demographic phenomena. And not in the Marxist way, not in the sort of David Harvey, which also I love, but not in the way that we say, hey, culture is always necessarily the response or the reaction or the reflection or the end result of economic processes, but to see them more in a dialogue. And I like that opening that the idea of mood offers. And so, how much time do I still have left? Okay. And so I would say that the mood, this mood is related to some of these are our body's incapability or different capability to deal with some of these changes, these very real changes. And so I'm thinking here of all these crises, and I call them global crises, because the wonderful thing for most of these crises is that they are crises for a particular group of people. When we are suddenly all against capitalism, it is because finally in the West we understand what capitalism really is. Other people have understood this for a very long time, and I guess we also now suddenly realize what capitalism can do, how it operates, etc. Which is okay. So I'm not against capitalism, but against this sort of very perverse form of capitalism that we have right now. So there's a geopolitical crisis, the shift from a European to an American to a very different kind of world, financial crisis and ecological crisis, the Anthropocene. This is probably the most important, the last one, I think. They necessitate, I guess. They create a sort of necessity. We have these sort of digital revolutions which create the ability to change. The TV logic of my youth is a logic in which you are always passive and you have no choice of contributing to the public sphere. You are living in a sort of consumerist society, and suddenly with Twitter, I don't use it, but with Twitter, you can produce something again to this public realm. And then finally, a demographic change, Generation A. This is Foster Wallace writing ages before something had happened politically. So we have the mood as a kind of response, as a kind of our body's problem with responding or dealing with the outside world. That is, I guess, how I would try and historicize the present. I don't have I have, as always, millions of examples that I don't have time to discuss. Can we come back to the as if maybe? I'd love to speak about the as if that's possible. I won't do it now. Yes. Because for me there is a sort of Hegelian Kantian argument. That's at the core of everything. It's a change from Hegel's history to Kant's history. But so maybe we can come back to that. So there's many expressions, very different kinds of fish in the sea. Oh, very many different kinds of fish in the sea. Is this working? Oh yeah, there we are. So different kinds of fish in the sea. Post-irony, the return of a grand narrative, all these kinds of practices that we know well in the arts. New depthiness, things like that. The algorithm. But I want to finish, and I can come back to those things later on in the questions. I want to finish then with maybe some problems. Was that clear at all? Are you sort of, okay, is that semi-clear? Okay. So just to finish up, some problems with categorization, with trying to say, okay, we should understand all these fish in the sea, all these different artworks, and I understand that this metaphor is becoming really insane, but to say, okay, all these fish in the sea, we should understand them also in terms of the taste of the water that they're swimming in. And then to map out that taste, because I'm not a great philosopher, this is obvious, but also I'm not someone like Timothy Morton or Rosie Braidotti, or I'm not one of these great philosophers who can put up systems of thought. I always am very envious of those people, because I think it's amazing. I always come after the fact as a mapper. I'm doing nothing more, trying to do nothing more than trying to map the taste of the water through these various artworks. And so this process of mapping the taste of the water has some problems of mapping it and then naming it. And I think these problems are very obvious, but I want to explicitly also mention them. The first, of course, as we discussed in the beginning, is the question of selection. How do you decide which works, which practices are more dominant, are more of that moment, are more popular than others? Yeah, so that's a problem. In my case, I've just literally been looking at stuff that has been really repeated on all the fairs and all the gallery shows, etc. That's coming back and back and back and back and back. Or books that are on the New York Times bestseller lists, or that get these super positive. So I've been looking at the kind of reception of these works to understand for myself what may be a dominant move. But this is, of course, a problem, and we can debate this. And I'm 100% sure that one of you will say, hey, but I've got another, and that I will say, oh, I'm sorry, I take it all back. And so this could be part of the problem. There's a problem of reduction. I think this is a huge problem. And this is the Zizek problem, that you have this sort of grand narrative or theory, and you're reducing all the artworks to this particular kind of lens. And it's the worst thing, of course, that someone can do, to say that an artwork is only this or is only this. The sort of pigeonholing of focusing, of fixating an artwork, fixating a film, fixating a novel within that one framework. And so that's not at all the intention that I personally would have in this cultural mapping. I would say the opposite. I think all these artworks that I have here chosen are super rich. And the same goes for the artworks that I chose from the 90s, which are artworks that I really love very dearly, the two that I had included, that I think are amazing artworks. But so they are very rich, and I don't want to reduce these artworks. But I think it's a problem. I think if we categorize, if we try and historicize the present, put the present artworks within this larger narrative, there is the risk of reduction. There is the risk, definitely, of label fetishism. This is becoming an issue, I think, at the very moment around meta-modernist discussions. I'm super sick of the term. The risk of then trying to relate everything to that first kind of label that we may have decided on with particular people. The label comes last, I would say, always comes last and not first. And so if we imagine things are not as they were here, or as they are not as I'm describing, why stick to the label? I think we should happily reconceive labels or do something like it. And then these two, which is the risk of a self-fulfilling prophecy and the risk of co-option, of co-opting. And so in the sense that, of course, what trend watchers do is to calculate all possible routes from a given moment in time, to close down. This is what Shell does. This is what Shell does with their famous scenario planning. They have a fixed starting point, and they say, what can happen from this fixed starting point? And so they map all these different routes, and then they can make them cost effective. They can have a scenario ready to preempt all these different things. And so this is the last thing that I think should be happening. So this shouldn't be, by me speaking here or going to an art academy, become some kind of self-fulfilling prophecy where all these, I mean, there's millions of people like me doing this kinds of shit. And so it shouldn't be this thing where we close down the past, to close down the future or make any predictions about the future at all. It's trying to for just that moment, via that notion of the structure of feeling, make a snapshot of the situation at hand, make a snapshot of a moment in our very complex, very multiplicitous, incredibly virtual, incredibly driven by all these different moods that are like rivers flowing everywhere. this is a snapshot of one of these intersections. And it's nothing more than that at all. And so it shouldn't become a limitation for further discussion. I don't think that, especially in art, that art should respond to these grand sort of schemes. For me, that would be not so great. It's an attempt from an academic, semi-academic, to try and pin down some of these in order to be able to understand and begin speaking about it, and begin perhaps to see some patterns in time. Not a moment of self-fulfilling prophecy, and definitely not a moment of someone then owning that present or owning that future, or I don't know, maybe even putting like a patent or something on it. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that it was. I had a great finishing line, but I don't have it with me. I'm hoping that I'm super happy to elaborate on some of these points that I haven't mentioned in the question, especially Kant and Hegel. I really want to say something about that. So, okay, this was it. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Tim. That was a great start and incredibly engaging as well as thought-provoking. Now we're over to Ellen. And
what a wonderful and entertaining and informative and thoughtful discussion from Tim. Thank you for that. I'm really glad he brought up the concept of mood and explained it so clearly as this overall state of the organism, because that's sort of the approach that I've taken with my talk. And it's actually a talk that comes out of an essay that I was invited to write for the Zabludowicz 20th anniversary publication. And I was asked to write about sort of whatever I wanted in relation to emerging. And the thing that I know the best is working with emerging artists, because that's what I did for 6 years at the Zabludowicz collection. And so I've drawn upon that and upon my knowledge from the people I know and live with in the art world who are artists, and sort of tried to sketch together one scenario and one way to look at the development of an artist through its stages of emergence, and a possible way to somehow preserve that condition of emerging while also surviving as a person, probably living in a city and having a sort of healthy and relatively comfortable lifestyle. So I'll just jump straight into the talk. The essay is a little bit longer, but this is where I've chosen to start it today. So because the stage of emerging usually occurs in early to mid-adulthood, it is a stage at which many life choices and allegiances are still unfixed, a time which the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu recognized as being characterized by its indeterminacy and proximity to a state of adolescence. In his essay, The Invention of the Artist's Life, Bourdieu analyzes the social and creative evolution of Frédéric Moreau, the young protagonist of Gustave Flaubert's novel Sentimental Education, which was published in 1869. As an heir whose invested capital generates a fluctuating income, and as a man with similarly fluctuating interests, Moreau is able to delay his commitment to a specific career. This passive refusal casts him as a dilettante, the model of the indeterminate life that resists, for a time at least, the fate of social aging. And social aging is a phenomenon that Bourdieu defines as nothing other than the slow renunciation or disinvestment, socially assisted and encouraged, which leads agents to adjust their aspirations to their objective chances, to espouse their condition, become what they are, and make do with what they have, even if this entails deceiving themselves as to what they are and what they have, with collective complicity and accepting bereavement of all the lateral possibles they have abandoned along the way. It's a stark characterization, but a very interesting one in relation to the development of, let's call them, young or emerging artists. Bourdieu imagines this process as a tree with bifurcating branches, and this is an image by Patrick van Kakenberg, who describes his process of drawing ancient trees as akin to jazz improvisation, so something of a freedom in there. So the bifurcating branches, some dead and some alive, which represent the trajectory or the career, or retrospectively a CV. Most artists making work today do not benefit from anything like Moreau's privileged financial position. He was a 19th century bourgeois heir, after all. In many ways, he's a cliché of the 19th century bourgeoisie, whose inheritance distinguished him from those, and I quote, whose only capital is the will to succeed. In Flaubert's time, social aging involved the transformation from a state of indeterminacy associated with adolescence to one of mature and fully fledged bourgeoisie. Today, and on a personal level, social aging involves the unintentional narrowing of one's options for free expression by, let's say, taking a job, buying a house, having children, all those choices that tend to restrict an artist's ability to spontaneously act on ideas and inspiration, travel, to learn and to fail. Not always, but let's call it a trend. On the level of industry, gaining commercial representation, accepting private commissions, taking on teaching and public engagements can open some doors while closing others. As artists get older, it's natural that they desire and require an increasing level of stability and security. Yet, in our culture, there is still a deeply entrenched and perhaps idealistic expectation, frequently supported and condoned by artists themselves, that it is incumbent on the artist to resist social aging and maintain a state of perpetual indeterminacy. So, how might one resist social aging and the overdetermination of one's creative expression, while also fostering a modicum of stability and financial security in one's life? Moreover, how might artists do so in a world in which gentrification, another seemingly inexorable drive towards middle-class ideals, restricts the options for stability, for example, by making housing unaffordable to anyone not earning a large salary? In The Gentrification of the Mind, Witness to a Lost Imagination, the American author Sarah Schulman retraces the process of gentrification that started when landlords took advantage of the consequences of the AIDS crisis in Lower Manhattan in the 1980s and early 1990s. AIDS deaths left apartments empty and leases hanging, a situation landlords lost no time in exploiting by raising rents and rapidly moving out a mixed and creative community of low-income earners by making it unaffordable for them to stay. Schulman explains that in 1964, the British sociologist Ruth Glass coined the term gentrification to denote, and this is interesting considering where we are today geographically, the influx of middle-class people to cities and neighborhoods, displacing the lower-class worker residents. The example she chose was London and its working-class districts such as Islington. Schulman gives a poignant account of the social, material, and economic transformations of various neighborhoods that resulted from an influx of wealthy middle-class residents and property investors, and the related disappearance of immigrants and what she termed non-institutionalized artists and the socially marginalized, as well as financially disadvantaged groups from that space which had previously been so mixed. She constructs a compelling argument about the relationship between this process of urban gentrification and the concurrent gentrification of ideas circulating around the neighborhood. With the disappearance of those who think and behave differently, also comes the homogenization of ideas and the dwindling of options for divergent or radical thought. This gentrification of the mind affects creativity, politics, literature, and human interactions. In its espousal of middle-class expectations and ideals, gentrification complements and even enhances the phenomenon of social aging. Both sketch a trajectory from diversity to homogeneity, the arc of a person's biography and professional development from eclectic youth to stable maturity, or the ethnic, economic, political, or ideological smoothing of a neighborhood. To put it another way, Schulman's characterization of gentrification of the mind is akin to a process of difference transforming into sameness. Life in what was once a mixed urban environment turns into an experience of consistent normality. This process of replacing an eclectic and accidented landscape with a homogeneous one echoes the way in which some artists, stuck in a repetitious mode of production, there was no point in trying to improve the resolution, So the way in which some artists who are stuck in a repetitious mode of production put out the same work with minor variations, normalizing their oeuvre into a market and, if they're especially good at selling the same thing over and over again, an art history. While some artists may thrive in such circumstances, producing versions of works for sale to collectors, most would become atrophied by expectations to remake the same work again and again in different colors and sizes. How might artists resist such a gentrification of the work, as we might call it? For the countless artists working in metropolitan areas, how might they do so without sacrificing their place in an urban environment that is increasingly unaffordable? Compounding the trouble with gentrification, Schulman points out that the ease enjoyed by gentrifiers or their heirs comes at a significant cost and is usually accompanied by a blinkered perspective. She says, gentrified happiness is often available to us in return for collusion with injustice. This point has been taken up and developed by the artist Andrea Fraser, famous for performances such as Official Welcome and her work in developing the field of institutional critique. In a paper delivered at a symposium in Berlin in 2010, Fraser stated, "The glaring, persistent, and seemingly ever-growing misalignment between legitimizing discourses of the institution of art, above all their critical claims, and the social conditions of art have appeared to me as profoundly and often painfully contradictory, even fraudulent." End of quote. She goes on to list some of the factors in this misalignment, including the cultural prevalence of celebrity and spectacle, and the relationship between the increasing wealth of the richest minority of society at the expense of the vast majority. In powerful terms, Fraser expresses her disturbance at the way the discourse surrounding contemporary art contributes to creating a false meaning for art, and she identifies the, quote, almost total disconnect between what artworks are under these historical and economic conditions, and, on the other hand, what artists, curators, critics, and historians say those works are, especially works they support, and what they do and what they mean. This sobering indictment of the legitimizing discourse around contemporary art invites us to pause and evaluate our own role in the system. In a second article entitled Le 1% c'est moi, Fraser puts forward a detailed economic analysis of the relationship between art market prices and the wealth gap, really casting herself as an economic analyst. She demonstrates that and I quote, "the greater the discrepancy between the rich and the poor, the higher prices in this market rise." And since 2011, when Fraser wrote this article, the situation has become even more extreme. The April issue of the art newspaper reported that, and I quote, "The market is becoming increasingly top-heavy. There are fewer sales happening, but at higher prices. Almost," and this is worth saying probably twice, "almost half the total spend last year was on a handful of objects. 48% comes from 1,530 lots which sold at more than 1 million euros at auction." So almost half of everything that was sold in art in the world is 1,530 lots worth 1 million euros each. So Fraser's stark reality check concludes, and I quote, "Any claim that we represent a progressive social force while our activities are directly subsidized by the engines of inequality can only contribute to the justification of that inequality, the not-so-new legitimation function of art museums." And later she says, "At the very least, we must begin to evaluate whether artworks fulfill or fail to fulfill political or critical claims on the level of their social and economic conditions. We must insist that what artworks are economically centrally determines what they mean socially and also artistically." For Fraser, this calls for a radical solution. She calls for a long overdue splitting off of the market-dominated subfield of galleries, auction houses, and art fairs. It also determined a strict career choice for Fraser, as the writer Sarah Thornton relates in a footnote in a chapter on the artist in Thornton's book, 33 Artists in 3 Acts. So Sarah Thornton writes, "In January 2012, Fraser left her New York dealer, Friedrich Petzel, because she did not want to be involved with what she calls commercial art economy of sales to ultra-high net worth private collectors. She continues to be represented by Gallery Nagel-Draxler in Cologne, which sells her works only to museums. So to some, Fraser's stand may seem radical and self-defeating. To others, it appears risky or simply idealistic. In any case, it carries significant consequences in terms of relinquished income for Fraser herself. In her portrait of Fraser, Sarah Thornton mentions that the artist is also interested in Bourdieu's idea of social aging, and she quotes her as saying, "Artists don't have to settle on a station of status, a clear position, or a national identity. We can be children forever." Yet, Fraser's own decisions have strongly determined and narrowed even the future course of her own career as an artist, so there seems to be a paradox there. One response to the pressures associated with making work while resisting social aging, which could also alleviate the twin pressures of making work and making a living, is to share the burden of at least some of the many activities involved in maintaining a career. On one hand, collective art production is an ideological and aesthetic choice that winds together the challenges of collaborating privately and communicating to an audience. Many artists working in collectives also maintain a separate practice under their own name, juggling the multiple identities of sole creator and collaborator or member of a group. By working together, the common investment of time, energy, mutual support, and creativity can, for a time at least, lessen the threat of poverty and inertia. However, while practices of collective living, sharing, and DIY activities might enable artists and their close ones to survive on a lower income than living alone, the seduction of such a gift economy recalls the trap of neoliberal ideologies, such as the Conservative Party's Big Society campaign. In 2010, in pre-austerity, pre-election Britain, David Cameron set out his fantasy for civil society by saying, and I quote, "There is no them and us, there is us. We are all in this together," end of quote. As Patrick Butler, The Guardian's social policy editor, recently wrote, quote, "Now big society has disappeared entirely, like an embarrassing fashion item, worn once and pushed to the back of the cupboard. The PM last mentioned it at Christmas 2013. The phrase has been erased from official government discourse. The big society hashtag is used wryly to signify coalition hypocrisy and spending cuts," end of quote. Using utopian, poetic, or romantic rhetoric to mask a wider policy that imposes spending cuts to charities, arts organizations, and education, and which directly affects low-income workers like artists by drawing up grants, artist wages, and teaching by drawing up grants. This is not a new strategy to use this kind of poetic discourse. Fraser herself related of George H.W. Bush's 1989 election campaign, in which he, and I quote, "envisioned volunteers and community organizations spreading like 1,000 points of light," end of quote, in the wake of his rollback in public spending. In one sense, the romanticism of politicians' propaganda and Fraser's ideals of childlike indeterminacy are similar. They both suffer from their idealism, which tends to render them impractical. The reality is that artists live and work within specific conditions. In order to thrive, they must adapt and respond to their surroundings. It's a holistic question. This year, the 6 members of the Japanese collective Chimpom celebrate their 10th anniversary working together, and they continue to make thought-provoking work in various media, addressing current events around the globe through formalist aesthetics, performance, and interaction with a really wide range of publics. As one might expect, with such a diversity of opinions coexisting under one name, the theme of paradox has been central to their practice ever since they made their first work, Super Rat, in Tokyo, 2006. Exterminators coined the term super rat to refer to a strain of rat whose resistance to poison and proliferation in the main streets of the popular Tokyo district of Shibuya rendered them seemingly invincible. Chimpom have described the rats' coexistence with the fashionable arty teenagers who frequent the area, noting that both groups dine on the same McDonald's, the teenagers eating in the restaurant and the rats in the rubbish just outside. Chimpom have on 3 separate occasions captured rats in Shibuya using a net purchased at a local hardware store. These rats were then stuffed and painted in the colors of Pikachu, the popular Pokemon comic character, and staged in dioramas of Shibuya, exhibited with a video documenting their capture. For Chimpom, super rats are the main theme behind our, and I quote, are the main theme behind all our activities because we have to survive. We identify with the super rat, we have sympathy for them and respect them as peers, end of quote. Their affinity with the rats carries through to the effects of participation in the art market. And when the first super rat work was bought by a Japanese collector, the group was amused at the value the rats had achieved by becoming a desirable commodity, a success that they saw as, and I quote, flattening society and annihilating class and financial divisions. As individuals with a collective identity, as artists who cultivate a sense of indeterminacy and avoid social aging, while also resisting the gentrification of their work, and also maintaining a realist and even skeptical view of the market, Chimpom are just one example of how artists might be able to thrive in challenging conditions, transforming economic, social, and political difficulties into opportunities to create. But as a recent article about the collective made clear, and I quote, Chimpom do not live off their art. The three members have jobs, including teaching and design work, and for the moment at least, forming a collective will not make you rich. Like everyone, artists need stability in order to continue living and working healthily. Whenever I meet or work with a collective, I ask how they started working together. We studied together, we were friends, we were lovers, they say. The emphasis in these statements is on people and personal relationships. They imply time spent together, catalyzed by feelings of loyalty, devotion, and love, into the performance and production of creative acts. The process of identifying as an artist can be a lengthy and complex one, involving forays into other professions with greater or lesser success, and always the return to the state of indeterminacy necessary for creativity, a state in which courage, I believe, plays an essential part. The artist duo Samuel Levac and Jennifer Lewandowski, who met and started working together while studying critical fine art practice at Brighton University in 1998, have more than 15 years of experience collaborating. Over the years, they have frequently invited artists and creative practitioners to produce work together, often adopting the role of commissioners or curators for elaborate projects that they've conceived. In February 2011, they concretized their collaborative ethos by inaugurating French Riviera, an exhibition space in their studio, which is a former shop on the busy Bethnal Green Road here in London. French Riviera provides an eclectic and energetic program to the local community, which is made up of East Enders, second and third generation Bangladeshi families, and as well as a significant number of creative professionals. French Riviera benefits from the support of the artists' families and large network of friends and collaborators, as well as occasional grants from public sources such as Arts Council England. However, what has so far been a precarious enterprise now faces the threat of increased living costs and further swingeing cuts in public funding under the renewed conservative government here. So how can artists avoid a situation in which the condition of emerging becomes one of emergency? The multifaceted investment Levac and Lewandowski make in creating work and showing the work of other artists, in fostering a community of interested participants and inviting people to benefit from art, is seldom returned to them in any financial way. They and many other artist-run spaces and collectives are what Sarah Thelwall, who spoke here today, calls in her report Size Matters, has characterized as research and development units for culture at large. Their continuing practice relies on their adaptation to the context in which they work and their acceptance of a modest lifestyle. They are not in denial, I don't believe they are. They are lucid about their condition and the many challenges it continues to present them. This lucidity is in itself a form of thriving, the decision and dedication to make work in full cognizance of the obstacles and, to a certain extent, in response to those very obstacles. And I will quote them just to end the talk. As Levac and Lewandowski explained in a recent talk that they gave, and I quote, "figuring out our own beliefs, realizing that we already have an alternative lifestyle, a retro idealism that makes sense today through commitment to art and ourselves, helps us to understand how to exist in our modern world, how to thrive with an alternative lifestyle in London right now."
Thank you, Ellen. That was a really great follow-on, and I'm sure we'll pick up on how the ties between what you've been speaking about and Tim later. So, with no further ado, over to you, Ben.
Oh, right. Were you saying, you're not saying we're going to pause
No.
momentarily? Okay. Fine, sorry, I misunderstood you. Over. Oh, yeah. Thanks. Oh, wow, I should have printed that bigger. Right. No, light's fine. It's eyes that are a problem. Okay, I'm going to dive straight into this, but 3 apologies, no images. I'm going to read this to keep myself to time. And it's about history, so triple yawn, sorry. Okay. Oh, and it's not about collecting or emerging either. But that will become clear. Okay, so when I was asked to speak to the topic collecting the emerging in relation to my work on the archives of the Institute of Contemporary Arts in London, I'll confess that I was rather hesitant. Now, I'm aware that spaces like the ICA have played a vital role in the emergence of many artists' career, being as it is part of the art world's promotional and developmental circuit. And indeed, I should probably accord more than casual status to the role of the ICA within what one-time exhibitions director Lawrence Alloway called the art world as system, or I should say first called the art world as system, given that it was a vital space for the exhibiting of a new generation of artists in post-war Britain. Indeed, the period of the ICA's founding marks what Alex Mazaras, in his brilliant thesis on the emerging artist, for those who want to read something historical about the emerging artist, has argued was the beginning of the development of the idea of the emerging artist. Furthermore, Mazaras associates the idea of the emerging artist not just with an emergent neoliberal economy, but as much with post-war welfare state capitalism. The ICA's commitment to the contemporary, I think, relates to the anxiety of this post-war moment, where appeals to tradition and nationalism are necessarily tempered, not just because of the horrors of war, but because of Britain's shifting space on the international stage. The anxiety and opportunity sensed around the idea of the contemporary as it related to post-war re-emergence can be observed in the Council of Industrial Design's 1946 exhibition Britain Can Make It, ostensibly developed out of the Board of Trade's wish to revive British production in order to grab a share of the European and American market, in light of a faltering colonial market and the rise of the power of American goods. The hope of the exhibition was to both showcase and cajole British designers. The Council of Industrial Design, as the promoters of what would become known as the contemporary style, met with much opposition from producers of British goods who do not wish to change their processes and their emphasis on quality and variety for a more lithe and responsive idea of trend and fashion. Within this context, the younger designer and artist, who was not bound by traditional methods and prejudices, was an obvious focus for the hopes of the Council of Industrial Design and other quasi-governmental bodies. However, by the time that Britain Can Make It was put before audiences, the agenda of a post-war Labour government to promote the values of the welfare state was more prominent than the explicit commercial imperative that had originally driven the concept. Emerging, and was therefore ended up being about more the idea of an emerging national identity than economy per se. Emerging in this context can be understood as an economic imperative, a design aspiration, a social reality, a nascent professionalism that was desired and being established with what we might now term the creative industries. The more socially progressive hopes of emergence, an equality of design and style reflecting an equality of opportunity and material reality, was soon abandoned in favour of a more speculative idea of emergence and wedded to the fantasy of wealth creation as a way of dragging the bottom up by the top. Related to this is also an idea of technocratic emergence and tied to new productive possibilities. Now, Mazaras argues that the increased professionalization of art and design created the emerging as part of a career trajectory, and I would say that this progressive development of a creative professional was metaphorically related to the idea of a national economic development. And to push it a bit further, I would argue that these not necessarily compatible ideas of emergence that are found in this period can be felt in tension throughout areas as diverse as post-war housing development, the art school sit-ins of 1968, and the subsequent creation of the polytechnic system. As such, emerging, although not exclusively market-orientated concept, for me problematically defines creativity through the imperatives of the post-war economy that pitched emergence against the perpetual fear of decline, and that's Britain's big fear in this period, as the logic that subsequently became reduced to a success-failure model of market testing. So I'm not that keen on emerging, is the upshot of that. As much the idea of emerging, the notion of collecting, especially when animated in relation to a market-orientated notion of value, as indicated above, gave me pause for thought. What is it to privilege the act of collecting with its phases of a speculative valuation, acquisition, accumulation, possession, and decirculation as a method of cultural formation? Does value have to be bound up with collecting, canonical formation, preservation, and ownership? Is, as Boris Groys has argued, culture fundamentally an economy, although not necessarily a money-driven one, but one whose internal driver is hierarchical differentiation, that alone is sufficient to produce the desire for the new? And if it is, must the cultural archive that the new is predicated upon ultimately take the form of the official museum or private collection? If, as Walter Benjamin proposed, the collection only means something to its collector, only lives and breathes as an extension of the collector's desire and history as collector, how does the collection signify as an institutional, non-personal formation once it's removed from the personal triumph of the collecting moment? Unto itself, removed from the collecting event, what relationship does the collection propose amongst the objects that it encapsulates? The collection is a form of valuation that relates its objects to each other through synecdoche, whereby interchange takes place between the totality of the collection and each object that constitutes a part of its whole. Ultimately, the collection and every object in it affirms the institutional realities that made the collection possible, the forms of capital and labour that had to be levied to bring the collection together. Furthermore, the persistence of such energies of investment and exchange maintain its cohesion and must be constantly renewed silently to strengthen the bonds of the collection. Certainly the ICA was a space intimately related to the idea of collecting, founded in part by collectors, at times a place that sold work, and an important transactional and transitional space, the accumulation of symbolic capital through the showcasing and framing of work that ultimately might find its way into a collection. Despite this, perhaps my uncertainty around the idea of collection as a privileged institutional form and subject for discussion is understandable, given that what has preoccupied me about the study of an institution like the ICA is the very fact that it does not have a collection, and that its mere frame, a platform, a shell, into which things are placed, through which things and people move, and around which ideas circulate. The lack of permanence and acquisitive function in an institution like the ICA interests me for two reasons. Firstly, because it seems to implicitly question the act of collecting simply by the necessity of creating forms that allow valuation, encounter and exchange without the appeal to permanence, gathering and ownership. Secondly, because its lack of permanent context brings into question the very notion of the cultural institution that is generally centred on the fixity of collections, repertoire, canon and legacy. Where does institutionality reside, and how does institutionality take shape, if not in and through its most stable facets? And I think this relates a lot to questions about institutionality, or emerging questions about institutionality that came out yesterday. The ephemeral, in short, an exploration of the ICA as an historic entity forces one to consider the temporary, the casual, the ephemeral, the hasty, the uncertain, the failed, the forgotten, the everyday, and the materially poor. My uncertainty about collecting matched the equivocation I encountered in the minutes of the first meeting of the ICA, of the founders of the ICA. In 1946, when they met for the first time, or officially met according to the minutes for the first time, the possibilities of the project were informed and bounded by the successes and failures of existing institutional entities and proposals to create a space where artists of all kinds could come together in the pursuit of something we might call the experimental. It took its points of reference and departure from specific institutions as diverse as the Museum of Modern Art New York, the Leeds Art Club, the V&A, the BBC, the Bauhaus, etc., etc. The generic institutional forms that were incited and resisted included the library, the art school, the studio, the workshop, the salon, the commercial gallery, the programme, and the exhibition. With the museum, I would argue, right at its centre of all of these institutional forms. As I've written about elsewhere, by the 6th meeting of the group, the word museum had been substituted for institute, contemporary, modern for contemporary, yeah, that's right, art for arts, ICA, yes, get there. Okay, so it was not, so in this kind of concept of the rejection that I see of these institutional forms in its founding, I'm not arguing that the new venture was radically opposed to the collecting institution. Indeed, its conception could be conceived as much complementary as indifference. But in refusing through accident, pragmatism and design the collection as a primary instrument for the establishment of cultural value, a gap was opened up that appeared as a question, calling as its answers past, extant and yet to be imagined propositions for a configuration of the temporary, the immediate, the dematerialized and the disparate. My question then is, how might one relate or animate the traces of such a space in a way that is not for the purposes of canon formation, canon correction, or the accumulation or centering of capital? There is another way. What formation and activity might be suggested in opposition to the collection, and what state of becoming might be imagined that is replete with potentiality, and I use that word on purpose rather than possibility, rather than predicated on the singular possibilities of success or failure? How, in other words, to keep open the question that the ICA's emergence made manifest? Now, Mazaras, in his thesis, uses Raymond Williams's idea of the emergent in his discussion of emerging, and puts it in opposition to the temporal signifiers of generation or youth. Emergent, as Mazaras observes, is a more complex notion, harder to discern, dependent as it is on its radical difference for Williams, this is, from the dominant culture. Now, for Williams, the emergent must represent a break with the dominant and not just be a species-specific, as he calls it, development of the dominant culture, and thus merely novel. Williams introduced the idea of the emergent alongside the residual and the dominant in order to overcome the totalizing effects of epochal analysis that he felt had dogged certain strands of Marxist interpretation, and in order, I think, to resuscitate the agency of cultural production. The residual and the emergent for Williams represented spaces and forms of potential, autonomous, disruptive and resistant activity. To put this another way, what Williams' tripartite model allowed for was the recognition of the material realities that bounded possibility, and yet the persistence of hope manifested as an excess in the system. However, whilst the residual seems relatively straightforward in its cultural status as the non-nostalgic persistence of practices and forms that constitute a different sociality that is no longer a dominant one, the emergent is a kind of more slippery fish. By being both qualitative and merely temporal, certain questions arise. From where does it emerge? Is it always ultimately co-opted? Does emergence persist as a state of becoming, or does it only exist as a momentary eruption? A brief phase of indiscernibility that becomes necessarily abjected or instrumentalized. Although for Williams, the emergent is related to burgeoning consciousness, or rather the possibility of a different sociality best discerned through artistic works as practical consciousness that access and create a new structure of feeling, as we've heard about, the temporal dynamic of the emergent, its semifactive quality, its flickering, seems to suggest something more like a potentiality that is never fully encapsulated than the dominant culture's particular forms of instrumentalization. As Williams unfolds the challenges of identifying the emergent, he comments, quote, "Again and again, what we have to observe is in effect a pre-emergence, active and pressing, but not yet fully articulated," end quote. Later, Williams asserts that this pre-emergence is a stirring at the, quote, "very edge of semantic availability." The pre-emergent is then something which can operate as a pressure on the dominant logics of the present, but only by not yet being fully present, an affective stirring, if you will, my words, not Williams's. What might it be to encounter such moments of pressing, moments prior to classification and naming, not in their pre-emergence with historical hindsight in play, but as pre-emergence, a pressure exerted by the presence of nothing more than potentiality, that is, the moment towards the hope of a different present and therefore a different future, which I'm now learning is part of my zeitgeist. To do this, it is necessary to uncollect culture, to detach from the institutions of valuation that allow us to discern with hindsight something real value, realized value. To uncollect, the form I want to invoke is that of the archive in difference to the collection. The archive, institutionally speaking, is a collection, a gathering in the name of an institutional logic. However, whereas the collection points into itself, obscuring its institutional formation while shoring it up through its naturalization, the archive is embedded and parallel structure, pointing outwards at the institution, spatially and temporally defined as such, that generated its contents. The collection speaks only to what is present, whilst the archive points to what is no longer present as document, testimony and witness, whilst presenting its fragmentary items as a radical presence. This is not to draw an ontological distinction between what is organizationally designated as archival collection, after all a document can be an object and vice versa. Rather, I want to invoke the archival as an engagement with provenance that locates statements within the organizational flow of the everyday machinations of institutional process, including the realities of accident, amnesia, willful destruction and unthinking accumulation that may never be fully discerned, and simultaneously as a form of encounter in which value is only potential, not already decided and designated. In this moment of encounter, fragments begin to relate, this is all a bit magical, to other fragments, then a specific archive and without the archive, across time and space, connecting impulses, other instances of emergence. However, unlike in the collection, the connecting is not a gathering, not a desire for representational completeness or representative selectiveness, but an imaginary joining of dots, critically created as an archive of a yet-to-be-imagined institution. I would describe this process, after Hal Foster, as anarchival, as it is much a subversion of the archive's function as it is a utilization of its institutional efficacy. To make this a bit more concrete, to explore this idea further, I wish to turn to an archival fragment from the ICA archive and imagine it as an instance of exemplary pressing of pre-emergence. In 1954, ICA film programme at Brenda Poole wrote to director Derek Knight, and I'm going to give this in full because it's quite nice. Quote, "A small group of members are very insistent that we should study the popular cinema as an important social phenomenon. E.g., why Marilyn Monroe has become so widely accepted as a symbol of desirable femininity. I thought I could have answered that one easily, but they insist that I'm simplifying, and that if one could find the answer, one would have found out a lot about our age, etc., etc. They even went so far as to suggest that members should be encouraged to go each week to one of the current releases, and then that we should hold a discussion here about them afterwards. I'm out of sympathy with this view, which I consider inverted snobbery, but they are intelligent people and very vocal at present, though few, so I thought the best thing, part to pacify them, and partly to see whether there really is something in what they want, was to ask one of them, a foreign lady, called Mrs. Magda Cordell, to put down a rough scheme and let me have it." End quote. Following this communication, there is a letter from Brenda Poole to Magda Cordell stating that she thinks the draft proposal is a good idea, even if she disagrees with some of the statements. And then, and this is this moment of archival wonder where you think, bloody hell, I've made it, I'm a researcher. when you turn over, and there's the proposal, or you think, there's no author on it. But I think from what it says, it probably is Cordell's. However, for the sake of this anarchival encounter, the non-disclosure of the proposal's author helps release it from this historical obsession with names and legacies and returns it to fragment. I shall quote from this proposal, very briefly, because it's quite long. Movies as anti-art. Oral visual experience in the dark. Note, with Wagnerian romantic total work. C. Goodman, The Shape of the Screen in the Darkness of Theatre, Partisan Review, 1942. Movies as social creation, not individualistic experiment. Documentary, defined as late picturesque romantic nationalism. New techniques reinforce familiar material. Camera's libidinous inspection of human figure. Hollywood as Hollywood. Ideas about love and death, statistical psychology of Kinsey's friend Albert Ellis. Note, movies to ads and comics, motion studies and magic, see Lancelot Hogben from cave painting to comic strip. End quote. What to do with such a fragment? Of course, we can read these documents, letters, notes, proposals as part of the ICA's collections, its archive, its historical capital. In this sense, the message here is that the ICA fostered the emerging ideas of a media-savvy younger generation. I would suggest that Paul's statement is, in this sense, institutionally revealing of both the pragmatism of tolerating difference to maintain the status quo, but also the value of backing something you don't understand or even agree with, because you're aware that it is different. This is untested, uncertain, of potential value, even if we can't see it. Perhaps this was the unique function of a place like the ICA, perhaps. We can also recollect Cordell's proposal in terms of dominant art historical narratives of pop art's development in response to a nascent consumer economy. We can use this to revise Magda Cordell's importance within the very art historically important independent group, to assert the prescience of the independent group, or to demonstrate how British pop art really did come from a critical interest in dissecting, not just celebrating popular culture. But how to encounter its pre-emergent quality, its partiality as a fragment, and its status as proposal. Not even a proposal, but an approach, a sense, an attitude. Putting technology, desire, audience, producer, icon, folklore, broadcast media, and avant-garde sensibilities together to suggest a different way of consuming or critical doing. Not as a structure of feeling, not yet a new consciousness, but a feeling structuring. A pre-identarian meditation on creativity and its material realities. Material, as Williams' idea of cultural materialism would have it, material as a non-reductive notion of practical social process, proposing a fundamental link between our consumption of images and our desiring, becoming selves. Ourselves as mediated, imagined, produced, and producing. The list of stunted beginnings, shoots of ideas, Cordell's list, echoes from the echoes down the years through feminist and queer accounts that reread film and the film industry. Laura Mulvey's Visual Pleasure, Vito Rosso's Celluloid Closet. But I want to suggest that Cordell's proposal does not merely presage, or does not have to merely be understood as a presaging, but also suggests something of pre-emergence itself, before explicit agendas and political awareness. The projection of the common sense encapsulated by Paul's aside that Monroe's appeal is obvious in favour of a utopian communal critical sensibility, the emergent consciousness of a mass audience, is a reaching out before an idea of what is even being reached out for, a pressing on the dominant forms of cultural value and critical discourse at the edge of semantic and, I would add, formal availability. Symbolised here by a hasty and incomplete nature of the list, its tentative references and disregard of intellectual or disciplinary boundaries. Its half-formed themes suggest the radically deconstructive potential of the thematic, whilst indicating the thematic's purely speculative, and I mean philosophically so, function. I don't want this fragment to be collected, to be made to signify in a known institutional situation, the museum, art history, the legacy of the independent group. I want it to remain ephemeral. The ephemeral, the theorist of queer archival utopianism, Jose Esteban Munoz, now sadly no longer with us, wrote, quote, does not equal unmateriality. It is more nearly about another understanding of what matters. He conceived of the ephemeral as the basis of, quote, a hermeneutics of the residue, that allows one to get lost, I would say lost in the archive perhaps, in order to get, quote, lost from the evidentiary logic of heterosexuality. And might we say, to relate, I think not unreasonably, Williams to Munoz, lost from the dominant culture. To pursue ephemerality is, as Hal Foster says of the archival interest of contemporary artists, to court the fugitive rather than the fungible. And I think this is important. I will stop in a minute. I think this is important at a time when tremendous pressures on cultural institutions, from the threats of funding cuts, the logics of economic viability, that are enshrined within the hopes of an emerging creative economy or the return on investment through the support of an emerging artist, forces institutions to turn possessively to their archives and collections, to see what can be levied as historical capital to mitigate against the fickle present and to prove the metal of their pre-emergent prescience. I want something of the pre-emergent in its register as critical utopian hope to remain, if not more than the possibility of instituting another way, a desire for coming together of a communal criticality. And I'm using utopian here in a critical sense. I think utopianism has a pragmatic function. Cordell's list is a pre-emergent, non-proposal for a not quite anti-institutional form, for an expansive cultural materialism that sees a visit to the cinema as a chance to explore sex and economics. I mean, when isn't it? And more importantly, sees the cultural institution as a place to be co-opted by a casual conversation with deadly serious possibilities, potentialities, and not as the site for speculative investment in future success.
Tim, if you'd like to join us. Thank you very much. I now have the difficult task of trying to tease out points that we can all discuss coherently. And perhaps I might preface the conversation by saying that in as much as we are all sort of moving forward in sort of some unintentional way to an end, we don't know where it is, so we are all emerging in our ideas and our thoughts in relation to the conversation today. I am, because it was a lot to take in, so I need to refer to my notes in order to sort of, which I did number, in order to make sense of. So I think that if we were talking yesterday a lot about the idea of the emergence or the emerging from the outside, today we're thinking about trying to attempt to think about it, what does it mean from the inside? And perhaps to paraphrase some thoughts that have come up or ideas is to unpack this residue of, or there's the residual, which has sort of come up in quite a few, through Williams, in quite a number of your presentations. And perhaps to link that idea as well of the mood. I think, Tim, you set us up so beautifully with this idea of the mood as this unintentional space, thinking it through Carol. And that sort of links very nicely to the sort of the meditation on how to resist social aging, or in terms of sort of, if this is the mood, what do we do about it? And I think that with Ben, you positioned us very nicely thinking about what is our inheritance, really, or a sort of cultural inheritance, a sort of theoretical inheritance about this idea about collecting and about emergence
through your presentation with respect to the ideas of the ICA. So I think there's sort of beautiful links that I hope that we can sort of pick up on. And I might start off in a way with a question to Tim, if I can find my question. Yes. So it is perhaps to spend a little bit more time about thinking about our present moment as this characterized by this pendulum that's swinging continuously between irony and sincerity, or knowing and naivety, and perhaps we might think that there is that opens up an interesting gap, and in that gap there is a sort of something that we might call or refer to as a neo-romanticism, if you like, and so perhaps the question is sort of where does the romantic sit in all of this, and is also the question of thinking about the archive and another way of not collecting, of the uncollecting culture, sort of sit with a sort of romantic notion. I mean, does that sort of feel as if that's a space we could start to talk about?
Yes. Yes. I mean, yeah. Okay. No. So I want to. I'm going to come to. Sorry. I'm going to come to the answer. I was thinking. So if I'm imagining sort of for myself the sort of the trajectory from the 90s to the present, I feel that if we speak about postmodernism, especially via Fukuyama, I'm always imagining this moment where Fukuyama says, this is the end of history, this is the moment of perpetual peace, the kingdom of all ends, depending of course on which philosopher you read. In this case it's Hegel and Kojève. And so there's this end moment, and I see this as a mall, because all the postmodern or writers who write about postmodernism always use this metaphor of the mall. And so I'm thinking, okay, we're all there, and we've had all those horrors of all those grand projects, those grand modern projects that failed on us, and that just created all this misery for us. And so at one point we come there, we are in complete disarray, maybe this is the 80s or something, and then Tony Blair stands there smiling, and he says, hey, come in guys, I've got something for you. And so we go in, and then the door is barricaded, of this mall, barricaded. And so Tony Blair, or I mean, I always use Blair, but you know, whomever we want to think of, the sort of neoliberal or liberal democratic sort of moment. And so they invite us into the mall, and then the doors are barricaded with all the memories. Perhaps it's also the archival material of all these horrible events that have led us there. Holocaust, communism, and so we are like, okay, we should never go back out of that door because that's a terrible move. And so we move into this mall, and it looks really nice. Like there's lots of shops around us, and we can consume all these things, and the air is kind of nice and cold, and so we keep walking, and we go in circles, and all our routes are completely preempted, and space is entirely preconceived, but nonetheless we are enjoying it. And then, and I steal this from Camille de Toledo, who wrote an absolutely fantastic little book called Coming of Age at the End of History. I don't know if anyone knows it. This book is just, it's just amazing. And he says, at one point there's this moment where we have an asthma of the soul. And for him this is the moment, I'm guessing, that when we are in this mall and the air conditioning is beginning to bother us. It's not natural air, and we're beginning to, as you do in hotel rooms or lobbies, you begin to sort of notice the air conditioning. And so even before something goes all right, there's this moment where you have this, I am coming too. And so you have this sort of asthma of the soul, as he calls it. And so we are beginning to feel, I don't know, kind of miserable. There's something is not good in this mall. Then, of course, the crisis happens, the shops begin to be boarded up, and the GP's offices are entirely filled with asthma patients, and so it's becoming increasingly obvious, and it's becoming increasingly obvious that we need to have an alternative. We need to go out. But the doors are barricaded, and there's no walls in the mall. There are never windows in the mall for some reason. There are always walls, but there are windows. It's always glass, but it seems to be inside, this sort of hybrid space. And so what is happening, I guess, is this moment that artists, and for me there is also a very important role for artists, no matter what, is that artists begin to paint windows on the walls. They don't know if there's an outside left, because we don't know, because we've taken this one particular route of capitalization, etc., from the 50s onwards, I guess, and so we don't know if there's an alternative yet, but artists and philosophers, speculative realists, are beginning to paint these windows onto these walls saying, we don't know if there's an outside, we cannot really check it because of all the shit that happened with modernity, not modernism, but modernity, and so there's this painting of windows on the wall, to imagine another outside in order to reconceive of the inside of the mall. And so this process, I guess, is looking for a language. I like that, the feeling that's beginning to structure. It doesn't really have yet some kind of language. I guess in order to begin to conceive it, in the early 2000s, many artists were returning to Romanticism as a kind of model. And so when Robin and I wrote that very flawed, very problematic first article, we were very much under the influence of our former mentor, Jos de Mul, the great philosopher Jos de Mul, who writes about Romanticism precisely as this oscillation between irony and enthusiasm. And so for us that was perhaps a first try and attempt to give these windows, the outside, a kind of a face. And I'm guessing now, slowly, we're beginning to see all kinds of faces, but to me it seems still this weird process of painting windows, of trying to somehow relate to an outside that we don't know is there. And so to find some kind of ontological thing outside. And the archive, I like also this so much. The idea of the archive, I guess, is perhaps where we can find strategies. I was reading Mackenzie's work, I don't know if you read it, Mackenzie's work, Molecular Red. This book really blew my mind like nothing else I've read in the last year. And so what I like about Mackenzie's work, Molecular Red, is that he's going back to sort of the crossroads of history, where certain theorists and certain regimes won the fight and others were lost and so forgotten. So Bogdanov, who was playing chess apparently on Capri with Lenin all the time, his theories were, except for in Russia, forgotten by us, whereas Lenin's theories were used and led to all this stuff. And so he goes back to Bogdanov, and he begins to go back to some of these crossroads to see which other routes we could have taken. And I like that idea that he does that. Also science fiction, Kim Stanley Robinson is one of his case studies for a new methodology. And so I like very much that idea of perhaps retreating into archival materials, re-evaluating all these routes not taken or not understood or not etc. And so perhaps that's also a way into...
I'd like to, I mean, we could move straight into archives, but we could also go via romanticism. And I also would like to bring Ellen in on that thought, perhaps thinking through that idea of the state of emergency, because within the state of emergency, that is also a space in which romanticism shows its head, and perhaps there was something that you might wish to expand on there.
Just in response to what Tim said just now, I just thought of this idea of the romantic rhetoric and language and these sort of florid kind of depictions or imaginations of the way things can be, and sort of the two that I quoted in there of the big society and then the Bush's points of light, as these sort of, you could think of Mao and the 1,000 flowers or whatever, and how that they function as these sort of artificial sweeteners for the labor kind of the actual kind of actions that are being put in place by governments. And I think, in relation to artists and how they decide to kind of depict themselves in their own self-image, that romanticism has a part to play. But I think it's a strong kind of spice in a way, and it should be used with caution because it can precisely flip from sincerity to irony, and I mean, partly that is what's attractive about it. But I think it's it's important not to be co-opted by the person who wishes to control you based on what you say you are.
With this is that's a very important point and distinction that you've both made on that. But I slightly like to press the point still on the issue of, if we take Tim's point on the idea that the mood is sort of characterized by this sort of tension between resources and the challenges that we face, which again links to this sort of state of emergency. It sort of still might sort of point to the fact that from the perspective of artistic production and from within the space of artists making work, that there is some sort of desire that we might see or note or map to kind of paint those windows on the walls, if you like, to actually sort of imagine something different. and what are the possibilities in a way of imagining something different. And so I just wondered, from your experience of working over the past 6 years with emerging artists, if you had noted any of that sort of sentiment, or
sometimes. I mean, it's very difficult to generalize, and I'm loath to represent artists, because I'm not one. So I bumped into a friend a few days ago, and he's leaving London because he's got a job elsewhere, and he said that what he noticed was an aesthetic of despair as being the dominant aesthetic in London now. And I can't agree with that, because I don't believe that that's what artists are mostly making. And if I did, I think the kind of consequences of the logical consequences of that are not. Are just too depressing, and no, I don't want to believe in that. And also, I think there's enough evidence that artists are sort of affirmative / critical in a lot of their work. But I think that we're in a time now, especially with the recent elections and the result of the new government, I think we're at a time when people are reconsidering their place in London, and it's important to discuss all these things. I also bumped into another friend recently who's moved to New York, and he said, "Oh, Ellen, you're one of the survivors in London." And it was a sort of joke, but it also there's some truth to it, that a lot of people have left London recently, and I think we need to kind of talk about that openly, and talk about, there's a lot of debate around artists' fees and campaigns, and a lot of really sort of activist sort of discussion at the moment, but
So, basically, sort of picking up from that, then, could we say that we are in a state of a fear of decline, but in a different type of decline than the one that was the the post-war sort of space of fear of decline, which was that was the sort of motivation, or sort of the driving force to a lot of activity at that time.
So you'll have to forgive me, because I see everything through the lens of anxiety. And that's because I'm an incredibly anxious person. But I always think, this is all about sort of different forms of anxiety. So I always think the post-op moment, and it's not just me who said this, it is a time where a lot of things, anxiety, we have to bear in mind, is very closely related to excitement. So we have this very strange sense in the post-war period, this kind of tremendous excitement about possibility, but huge anxiety about all sorts of forms of catastrophe that are well beyond one's control. And then British decline is kind of this weird underlying thing, if we want to sort of typify a mood in Britain, and that's there, but we're always in decline, aren't we? Still declining as we speak. So I do think that kind of carries on. The thing that interests me here, I guess, is that then what we're talking about today in a way is how to locate yourself historically. And we're just in the aftermath of election. It's probably the first election that I've experienced that's been massively affected, for me, by Facebook and Twitter. So maybe they've got a kind of over-sense that there is a kind of greater historical consciousness than there was. But it feels like we're kind of grappling with some sort of historical consciousness. I'm interested with how we're doing that, how we're thinking historically, or how we're choosing to think historically. And I think this was a point that you touched upon, Tim, is that there's a kind of, once you decide that it's not the end of history, then you're kind of more interested in history again, right? But you're not. But the point, I guess, that you seem to be suggesting is that one can't go back to history in the way that it was. You can't go back to those huge narratives and those things. So what do you go back to? And that's why I think there is. It's not what my paper was about, but it so happens that my interest in archives just purely, fairly coincidentally, coincides with a huge rise in interest in archives as a source material for practice. So I've been asking myself alongside this work, well, why? Mm-hmm. And the archive is a place that we understand as a point where we can have some access to some other time and place. And yet, by working with an archive in a different way, you're not necessarily repeating the traditional use of the archive as the thing, the fact base that comes before the historical narrative. So instead, you're seeing it as a problematic place. And I very briefly quoted Jose Esteban Munoz, who I really like. Very sad that he died last year, because his idea is that in a time where you can't imagine ways out, and I think despite what Tim says. I think there's a tremendous sense that despite all these sort of pushings and noises, there's a sense you're in a system that really you can't change. Where do you go to for your alternatives and possibilities? And what Nuno says is you go in some senses to the archive. Well, he doesn't call it the archive, he calls it the then and there. And he's invoking Bloch's sense of hope and the use of the past. So I guess that if I'm going to kind of try and typify a structure of feeling, there's an archival structure of feeling which you do approach through this sense of kind of irony, in as much as you can make a kind of, what I just read out was kind of funny. In some sense, we can see it as naive, but also a sincerity that maybe we don't just progress in terms of ideas, but sometimes we have to go back and we have to look for those unexplored opportunities. And I guess I would say that it's not just a kind of about what-ifs of history. It's not about what-ifs in terms of, well, what if we picked up so-and-so instead of so-and-so? It's recognizing that, if we sort of put a kind of idea of dialectics into play, that things are always, that things are never kind of fully decided in that way, and there's always this kind of duality of potential. And so we see this very much, for example, in the student sit-ins of 1968, where on one hand what people are calling for is a much less essentialized art school training and system, where people are asking for a much more acute sense of social reality. At the same time, they're making demands that sound suspiciously like a kind of constant program of retraining for a technocratic society that Thatcher would love. So, and I wouldn't say that you go back and you say, well, they were wrong or they were right, or, they should have thought about it like this, but to recognize that at every moment you've got this potential forking. And I guess there's a question about, well, how do we encounter those forkings in our present moment? And to bring it back to Williams, how would we do that? I'm not sure I would totally agree with this or exactly put it in the way that Williams would, but he would say you do that through an engagement with your practical consciousness, and your practical consciousness is your culture. And forms of art practice are a particularly useful way of engaging with that. I don't think that answers your question.
Yes. Yeah. We have one question here and one question here then afterwards.
Thanks. There's just a really fascinating crossover just emerging between what you've been talking about and Alan's reference to gentrification. But, and completely what you said, I understand about ignoring the what-ifs. But in terms of the ICA's relationship with that, the austerity measures after the war, and then what emerged in terms of the cultural and arts infrastructure for Britain, one of the big what-ifs was what would have happened if the ICA had taken up the invitation to organise the arts programme for the Festival of Britain, because then the Festival of Britain becomes part of a narrative. It then keeps into the 90s. The New Labour movement was that it has now become kind of turned into the heritage of the Arts Council. So this is the story of Britain's visual arts, the whole relationship between the visual arts and then regeneration and gentrification, and becomes that story. That's only just sort of jumped into me. And also there's a very interesting your reference to the Design Council exhibition, again as a contrast to what is happening contemporaneously, was that with the Labour government that came in 45, completely by contrast to, we're not going to, the last election, we're not going to talk about arts and culture apart from a small bit attached onto education, and she was going to brush it under the carpet. Even with the austerity measures that they knew they had to embrace, and then setting up the welfare state and National Health Service, you had an extraordinary situation where the three leading members of the Labour cabinet, with both Dalton, Cripps and Herbert Morrison, they were all backing completely separate arts programmes. So they all had, Cripps was
I'm just going to have to interject here just to sort of see if there was a question that Ben could answer in relation to that, or if this could be a continued conversation that we could have, because we will have time, and I'm just conscious of the fact that we're already over time and there are other questions.
I suppose the question is,
I mean, I can respond.
probably respond, yeah.
I was very quickly to that. Firstly, do come have a chat, because you clearly know a hell of a lot I need to know. But also, I guess, just very quickly, it's a very complicated kind of trajectory to kind of trace right from 1945 to here. But one of the things that I guess I'm responding to implicitly in what I'm talking about is pushing against an idea of culture always being perceived in terms of heritage. And you know, the heritage agenda, where it's kind of this national capital. Let's not even talk about Isles of Wonder, or whatever the hell it was. You know, the way in which things are kind of all put together in terms of a story of heritage. And the other thing to say about that post-war moment is, yes, people are kind of wedded to it, but the spending is still very, very fractional and very, very small. I think the thing that's kind of hard to get one's head around, I guess, is the way in which a sense of experiment in relation to creativity was so incredibly pervasive. And I'm not really trying to make a kind of value judgment about this. I just make kind of several observations about that. Talking about the idea of newness and the desire for newness and experimentation. Not only is it considered to be absolutely essential for any reconstructing economy in the post-war moment, but also it's considered to be absolutely essential for the emerging Cold War. You know, we don't know what the other side's doing. We've got to take some really long risks, and we've got to start doing some really weird things. You know, you see that in, obviously, the US government and the things they were doing with drugs and other stuff in terms of their potential future warfare, right? So we've got to take these really long risks. And this is weird. This is not market risk. This is kind of risks about who's going to ultimately win some thing that's kind of way over there that we can't see. And I think what's interesting is that our frames of temporal reference have greatly shortened since then. And this is seen in all sorts of ways. It's seen, for example, in big businesses that used to have R&D departments that looked 100 years into the future. Now they only look 10, 20 years in the future maximum. So this kind of, now, of course, I'm not really assigning a value to this. I'm not saying, well, let's go back to the Cold War, that was a good time. You know, I'm certainly not saying that, but it's really interesting to think about how temporal frameworks and temporal thinking really shifts. And I would say the thing that, where I think Tim is absolutely right in trying to pinpoint something that's going on in the moment, the environmental question is going to be, is the thing that radically challenges the shortening of a temporal framework that had become, you know, to the point of what's going to happen in the next 6 months. Yeah.
Thank you, Ben. Do we have time for one more? There was one more here. So then, thank you.
I'll try and be brief. Thank you very much for 3 very interesting talks. I think I'm probably addressing them more towards Tim, my question, but any one of you can answer if you feel you want to go for it. But what I was curious about is that authorship of mapping issue that you were talking about quite a lot, and also about the context and how you described yourself as a Western white male. And insofar as we are, to use a Roland Barthes term, delivering this talk through a paternal tongue in the West, and how is it that when you're in Berlin, for instance, as a guy from Holland, that there's any parity with these concerns we're discussing here this morning or this afternoon within other languages? I mean, what about German, Spanish, French? This may be a bit left-center question, but it's just something that came up about as you were talking about the subtleties of the things that are not being said. These concerns are being expressed in a particular language, and I'm curious about if they're also present or symmetrically within other Western languages.
So do you mean the kind of mapping that I'm doing, if that same kind of mapping is happening in other countries?
Yes, I'm just curious, basically. Is this just going on within the mother or the English tongue?
No. I mean, I would say, I mean, I think I'm latest to this party. I mean, I started doing this in a response to automodernism, Bourriaud's project, which we spoke about it before, which I thought was at one point, at the same time, really spot on, and also problematic, kind of. And so, because I didn't think it put together all kinds of different observations, it was left with all these different kind of expressions without getting a structure of feeling right. But I mean, in Germany, I think one of the most vital people working on trying to map what's happening right now is O. Eshelman, who's a German thinker, who is writing about performatism, in which he creates a kind of model in which also something can happen, which outside of that model cannot happen. So Bajan Ader falling off of a branch, trying to fight gravity, he knows that it cannot happen, but in the frame of the performance, it can momentarily happen. So, I mean, there's so many more. There's postmodernism, there's the planetary turn, there is neo-modernism, remodernism, off-modernism, there's so many. And also the term metamodernism, as I said, is far older than I would ever. I mean, it's been around for super long. So I would say nothing is new, but hopefully, at least I'm hoping that at least the mapping that I and many others at the moment are doing, that offers a new insight, a sort of contribution to this debate, to which I am definitely very late. And the thing, I mean, I think it's really problematic that I am a white young man. I mean, generally, this is not. I was not. I mean, I'm not here. There's no gender. I'm not confused at this moment about my gender. But I mean, because I mean, I feel that it's been too often that how I'm going to say that white Western men from, I would say, from certain generations, I'm thinking here, I guess, who were big in the 70s and 80s, were making still that universal claim. And I feel that is so problematic. And every time that I'm in another context, in China or in Egypt, in Alexandria, the Contemporary Art Center, I realize that my story makes no sense at all, that I'm completely, I mean, it's ridiculous. And so I just don't want to make those claims. I'd love to make those claims, that universal claim, but I don't feel comfortable. And I don't think any of us should probably be comfortable doing that. So I hope that answers your question somewhat.
Thank you very much. I've been told that if there are any pressing questions to this panel, then we could invite them to join us at the end of the next one. So we'll just conclude with a round of applause.
Yes. Thank you, Nina. Thank you so much. So we're going to break now until 5 to 4, and then we'll be back here at, but yeah, go and have refreshments, refresh your brains down in the South Cloisters, and see you back here at 5 to 4. Thank you.